Welcome to everyone today joining us on this ethics webinar. You know, as I was reflecting coming into the studio today to record and perform this webinar, I was reflecting on a meeting we had back in June on a cold, wet winter's day, where the team presented the webinar topics for the back end of the year. Now, Jen Anderson, my partner in crime and very great friend, she got the really sexy and interesting grey listing webinar. I got ethics. And I'm not going to lie, I had visions of trying to have an interesting conversation with an old and balding professor who was as bored with ethics as he sounds. And while you, the audience, would probably spend an hour updating their email. I know how these things work, you see. Incidentally, Jen's grey listing webinar was superb. And if you missed it, I really recommend you watch it. It's available on our website, INN8.co.za, under the INN8 Connect page. It's useful for anyone who's concerned about how grey listing will affect them and their clients. So pretty much for everyone on this webinar. Great job, Jen. Anyway, fast forward a few weeks and I meet Paul Vorster. He's not old, he's not balding, and he speaks with huge passion about ethics. I've really enjoyed getting to know him over the last few weeks. He's a research specialist at the Ethics Institute. He holds a doctorate of philosophy degree in industrial and organizational psychology. He has a special interest in how human behavior, values, and personality intersect with compliance-driven ethics initiatives. But most importantly, he is a huge rugby fan. And our ethics conversations over the last few weeks have swung across many subjects, lots of them sport-related, and I hope we can bring some of those insights to you today. Some of them are even controversial. He consults with many organizations across many industries, including ESCOM. And today we'll be covering such topics as why ethics is important, recent developments on ethics initiatives across a wide variety of industries. With the relatively recent uprising of woke activism, has ethics gone too far? And is the silent majority being held hostage by a few extreme keyboard warriors? Has the fear around cancel culture led to defensive play towards ethics rather than collaborative and progressive conversations? Has the advent of an ethical society consigned us to a future of boring Djokovic's, and have we therefore shut the door on exciting McEnroes? Bit of housekeeping before we get going. We've applied for an ethics CPD point for today's webinar, but this will only be available if you stay for the whole webinar, and I hope you do. Or if you're watching the recording, please complete the 5 survey questions at the end, and then you'll be eligible for your CPD point. There will be a chance to ask questions. Please add them to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and we'll address them at the end. So Paul, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's great to be here, Georgina. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to the next hour. I think it's going to be great. So Paul, you know, I was looking for a bit of research and a bit of inspiration to get us into the conversation. And you know, I came across this. Markets rely on rules and laws, and those rules and laws rely on truth and trust. Conceal the truth or erode the trust, and the game becomes so unreliable, nobody wants to play anymore. The markets will empty, share prices collapse, and ordinary people find other places to put their money, such as into property or under the mattress, or perhaps these days into crypto. Those are the words of Charles Handy, from just the turn of this century. He's an eminent philosopher, I'm sure you know him, one of Time magazine's top 50 thinkers and a contemporary of Peter Drucker. And really, Paul, that's what we're talking about here, isn't it? You know, that's what ethics is, protection of truth and trust. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think, you know, we tend to have a very narrow focus when we look at ethics. We tend to think of ethics as rules or laws that we have to follow the sort of bureaucratic process in order for us to do the right thing, when in fact, ethics is none of those things. If we consider our civilization, how we've developed over time, there's an interesting story that kind of puts this into perspective. But if you go back 2,500 years ago to the Greeks living in their city-states, if you were a Greek living in Sparta, you would have viewed a Greek living in Athens as subhuman. And similarly, the Athenians would have viewed the Spartans as subhuman. Even though they have the same ethnicity, the same belief system, basically the same dialect that they spoke at the time. And then the Persians invaded, and the Greeks decided, but wait a minute, we're all human. It's the Persians that are subhuman. Let us form a republic. And so the idea behind ethics, and this is progress, right? This is how ethics has worked. We started in these small villages where we cared about one another only and really did not care about the tribe across the river. We were very paranoid about them. And over time, we have become one big global village. And ethics is very much at the heart of why we are where we are. I often use this example, but if you consider the amount of trust, cooperation, and especially the specialization, because if you specialize, you have knowledge that others do not have. And that means that those individuals have to trust you in order to execute your tasks effectively. And I think for an IFA, that's a very important point to make here, because the standard person on the street really trusts the specialist to give them the right advice. There's an inherent trust mechanic at play in our society. And if that trust is lost, or if there is dishonesty that creeps into a relationship, or manipulation, or coercion, or anything else that we tend to see as unethical, it can really erode, what we do in society and how we function. And I often throw this analogy out. How much trust is needed to fly a plane from Johannesburg, let's say, to Cape Town? I mean, you have to trust the pilots. You hope they didn't have some vodka in their orange juice before they got onto the plane. You hope that all the different specialities who built that plane knew what they were doing and had your best interests at heart. You hope that the maintenance crew did their job properly, that the air traffic controllers also, take you into consideration, and that your fellow passengers don't try something weird at 35,000 feet in the air. And yet, with all of these dependencies, we are able to fly hundreds of thousands of planes every week with very little incident. And I think this is a testament to ethics. Ethics is really about this idea of mutual beneficence. It's a pro-social construct. What that means is that it is there to help us and society to ultimately cooperate better, to work together better. And of course, as we know, working and living in groups, it is far more advantageous to do so than to be rejected from the group. I mean, in the ancestral past, if you were rejected from your group, that would have been death for you. So in the modern world, I think the same things, there are the same remnants left behind. But the very fact that you can meet someone in the street and greet them, and they don't just turn around and murder you or massacre you in the street randomly, is a testament to this cooperation and ethics that we have built over time. And it's a dynamic process, Georgina. It's never at an end point. There is constant wrestling about right and wrong in our societies over time. It is not something that is static. And very often people view the law as ethics, but remember, the law sort of floats in a sea of ethics. We decide as a society whether something is right and wrong, and then the laws usually catch up or are repealed. A great example of this is the marijuana debate, where 5 years ago this would have been an explicit drug, but because of medicinal uses and properties, people have relaxed on it now, and the law is following suit. So ethics is an essential component of our civilization, and without it, I don't know where we would be.
Paul, I want to take you back to that analogy you gave of flying a plane and all those other people that you rely on who aren't necessarily on the plane to get someone or a passenger from Cape Town to Johannesburg and maybe back again as well. So it's very similar in the IFA world. They're making calls on companies based on financial results. They have to trust that those financial results are what they say, or that their partners who they work with, be they DFMs or whatever, are also well versed in what's actually going on in those companies which they're investing their clients' money into. How has ethical regulation, if you like, changed for companies in the last few years? What have we done to try to bring more trust and more truth to help clients feel safer?
Well, I think if we start right at the beginning, Georgina, there's, Adam Smith with the free market system and capitalism. It was essentially, people think of it very much as an economic system, but in fact, it was a moral imperative. It was actually more of a moral theory than it actually was an economic theory. The reasoning behind it was that in a free market system, individuals would produce goods and services, there would be a demand for these, and if you were to produce substandard goods or services, or perhaps exploit the consumer, that someone else would step into the market and replace you, that it was self-correcting in essence. Unfortunately, I think Adam Smith had put way too much emphasis on human nature being good. And as we know, economies of scale started at the turn of the century. And by then, organizations started to become almost more powerful than states. They have more income, they've got a ton of resources, they've become these mega corporations. And the problem with mega corporations generally is that you've got so much power that you're harnessing. You better have some conscience when harnessing that power. And we've also seen that organizations can exploit, that there are certain individuals that can exploit others, to ultimately, pad the bottom line, so to speak. So there's been quite a bit of, we know of a number of ethical scandals that have happened, and these are actually more common than they are not. And they often ruin lives. They can ruin the environment. They can ruin communities. And of course, they can sink an organization. So over time, more and more rules have come into play to kind of make sure that organizations do not engage in this sort of reprehensible behavior, that they do not exploit the other. And there's a very simple way of understanding ethics, is that ethics in essence is about what is good for the self, me, my organization, my team, and the other, another organization, another team, a consumer, another stakeholder. So I have to try to balance what is good for me, the profit motive, the growth of my organization. But I also have to balance that with not harming my stakeholders, because organizations have made profits in the past off of the back of their stakeholders, exploiting them, harming them. And this is not great for an organization that has a lot of power, for an institution that has a lot of power and money behind it. For example, it takes me back to this case study of an organization in the US, which is now well known, Valiant, a pharmaceutical industry company who bought drugs and then pushed their price up massively, that some people with particular rare conditions had to sell their homes in order to purchase these pharmaceuticals. When the organization was asked why it did so, it said, well, it'll look into it, but it just wants to remind these legislators and Congress, etc., that they did nothing illegal. And actually, they didn't do anything illegal, but they were exploiting the consumer. So these laws and rules have come into play to kind of try to ensure good governance. And often we refer to those three little letters, the ESG, right? Imperative, that organizations need to be sustainable, that they need to consider social, environmental, as well as have good governance, within those organizations themselves. And this has kind of become a hot topic as of late, with more and more individuals investing in organizations that take this imperative seriously. In South Africa, we have a great document called the King Report on Good Corporate Governance. And the King Report, it's now in its fourth iteration, has really guided South Africa in terms of what we would want organizations to do from an ethical perspective. Some of these things have also creeped into the Companies Act. And the imperative in King 4, there's a statement in Principle 2 that says that it is the responsibility of the governing body of the organization to ensure that there is an ethical culture that's being built in that organization. It's not just managing ethics, it's more than that.
How do you show you've got an ethical culture? What does it look like? What are some of the recommendations of that King 4 report?
Well, King 4 really wants organizations to ensure that they manage their ethics effectively and that they report on this, either publicly, and especially if you're a private company, you are compelled now by the Companies Act to have a social and ethics committee or something similar. This is a subcommittee of the board that is responsible for ethics. And this is something that King has sort of brought in before the legal side came into play. Now, if you look at that, what they want basically is they want the organization to prove that it is engaging with its stakeholders, both its internal stakeholders, its employees, as well as external stakeholders, those that it engages with, such as consumers, partners, societies in which they operate, etc. And that it actually is doing its utmost best to balance the relationship between itself and its stakeholders in such a way that all those parties benefit from that relationship. The late Kimi Mokwetu, Auditor General of South Africa, stated at one point, and I think this puts it perfectly, he said that an organization should be profitable it should grow. They play an important part in our economy. They employ a large number of people, they pay taxes, they are also getting more involved in social issues. But the organization should never grow in such a way that it takes too much from the economy. So it should give back to the economy, and it should not take too much from it when doing so. And I think this kind of is what the imperative is at the moment behind ESG and ethics in organizations. So you have to report on this, Georgina. You have to engage in good ethics management. Organizations are now compelled to do ethics risk assessments where they evaluate the ethics risk in the organization itself, and they show that they are actually mitigating those ethics risks, and that they are engaging with their stakeholders, and that they are trying to balance that relationship. Something, for example, and this might come as a surprise or maybe not a surprise, but if you look at Steinhoff, one of the greatest collapses in South Africa of an organization, they actually reported in their integrated report for about 6 years that they did not have a social and ethics committee or a subcommittee of the board that governed ethics, that they did not have ethics management in that organization. They actually put it in the integrated report, copied and pasted it for years and years, saying, we don't have this yet, we don't have this yet. And of course, no one cared because they were doing so well until the ethical scandal took them. So you have to report on this. You have to ensure that you are transparent with your stakeholders and that you meet their legitimate expectations. You are allowed to not pander to your stakeholders' illegitimate expectations. But you should at least understand who they are, and you should engage with them, and you should try to balance that relationship as much as possible. And the internal audit function in most organizations will mark that homework and look at what the ethics function is doing. And ultimately, this must go in, if you're a private listed company, into an integrated report. And I sometimes wonder whether or not investments would do better if we actually read the integrated reports and looked at the ethics of the organization. Because in our research, there's a hell of a lot of prediction between whether an organization has ethics, is actually taking it seriously, and its long-term financial success over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years. I think the fact that Steinhoff did not care about this should have been a red flag to many investors beforehand, because of course we made profits, but when they crashed, we lost a lot. So, and often these relationships that IFAs have with people who invest in and ask them for advice are long-term. You want to ensure that those relationships last, that we help our customer or client, and that we can foresee if these things would happen in the future. So I wonder how many IFAs or people who invest actually look at the integrated report with specific emphasis on the ethics of the organization. This has become a big thing as of late with ESG investing, but I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to going forward.
And you mentioned there about the correlation between not having an ethics committee or an ethical integrated report and the propensity for that organization to go on a downward spiral and ultimately fail. Is that just a South African thing, or is that a global thing?
Oh, it's a global thing, absolutely. I mean, if you look at many other organizations such as Enron, for example, Arthur Andersen, there are so many tales of organizations that have either sugar-coated ethics in the sense that they present all the right words, but if you dig a bit deeper, you'll start to realize that they don't really care about those words. There's no alignment in terms of how they operate and what their values basically say. And I think this is a key element, Georgina, is all organizations have these values, right? These convictions, these things that they impart upon their members. And the question, of course, is there's always the mandatory performance value or excellence value of some sort or operational value, and then you've got one ethics value. And this ethics value sometimes reads, as integrity or trust. They usually use those words. But if you asked, these people in these organizations, what does it mean to have a value of integrity? They will often answer you and say, oh, it's about ethics. And then if you say to them, well, what is ethics? They'll say integrity. So they don't really know what this term means. And it is the responsibility of leadership in an organization to translate those values into the organization. But unfortunately, many organizations sugarcoat this. They, for example, have the values. They claim to be ethical. But I always say, if you want to see if an organization is truly ethical, look at whether or not its decisions, especially its financial decisions, are in line with its value system. And if they are not in line, then you have to worry, because it means that the organization is actually just trying to get people off their back in terms of demonstrating a candy-coated outer shell of ethics, when in fact it is not a deep-seated element within the organization itself. So I think there's a lot of this that has happened. It's not just happened in South Africa, it's happened all over the world. For example, in US markets, they still focus very heavily on compliance, building rules, which can sometimes stifle business, right? Whereas the new sort of age of ethics is all about values. It's moved beyond the rules and said, well, look, we're telling employees what not to do. We are told what we should not do. It's sort of very negative reading, because a lot of the sentences start with do not do this, right? And but the problem is you cannot make a rule for everything that can go wrong. And human nature is weird, because we tend to look at rules and say that which is not forbidden is allowed, right? Just ask a tax attorney or a tax lawyer. They will find ways around these rules. So the new age of ethics is very much about aspirational values. What do we aspire to be? What are those universal principles in our value system that are the guiding mechanism by which, if I engage with a dilemma, a challenge, an ethical issue, or I feel uncomfortable about something, I can rely on those values to help me solve this problem that I have in front of me. And I think for the IFAs, there's this very important lesson here, in that you might have an independent practice, you might work in a company that offers financial services. And my question often to IFAs is, do you have an ethics vision statement? Have you written down a statement that indicates how you want to do business from an ethical perspective? You don't have to share it. It can be something that you have internally that you sort of strive to do. And then if you want to go even further than that, you could build what is called a code of ethics, which is different from a code of conduct. A code of conduct is that do not do this, the telephone book of rules that employees never read. A code of ethics, on the other hand, is a few aspirational values. How we want to do business, how we want to treat our stakeholders, how we look at investments from an ethical perspective. And I think that this has become more and more important in the modern world, especially with investors becoming more savvy regarding investments, and also the fact that they've burnt their fingers with a number of organizations collapsing. I mean, in South Africa, we had major audit and accounting scandals, which means that it brings into question the trust that we have in the financials of organizations that are operating out there. So who is protecting us? Who is the sort of buffer between the naughty organization and the investor who was looking for a good investment opportunity? And the only answer I can come up with is the independent financial advisor, that this person should be savvy, not only in economics, but should also be savvy in terms of ethics, that we should actually know whether an organization is showing us a candy-coated exterior or whether they are actually, have the best interests of their stakeholders and their investors and their shareholders in mind. And I think that this is something that we as IFAs need to really look at much closer going forward.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, you touched on a lot of points there. And I think the point about, and I can see a few emojis floating up the screen, which is great to see, but the point about who do you trust? If I can't trust the auditors, who can I trust? And does it go so far as getting insight as to how auditors have tested the ethics part of an organization, the ethics fulfillment in an organization? Are we able to see that and therefore see examples of how their financial decisions have been guided by their ethical values and principles? Is that something that is enabled?
Yes, I think it's being enabled now. Georgina, I think there's an old saying for ethicists, especially those that work with organizations, that no one really changes until the heart attack, right? So your lifestyle is usually considered something that is secondary until you have a heart attack, and then suddenly you start eating more healthily and you look after your health. And this is very similar with organizations. Recently, especially in the audit and accounting professions, we know that almost every big audit firm in South Africa has had some form of scandal or were involved in state capture in some way or the other. Banks are also now being looked at more closely. But for example, there are regulatory bodies such as IRBA and others that are there, and professional bodies that are supposed to be there to protect the profession, that are meant to regulate professions to ensure that these individuals actually do what they are supposed to do. But to give you an idea of the damage that was done, I mean, if you look at the audit and accounting professions, in the last 2 years, the intake of new students into those fields has more than halved in South Africa. So it indicates just that the perception of the profession has dropped dramatically. And so we need to have these checks and balances to ensure that if there are bad actors, individuals who are out for their own gain, or are willing to manipulate markets, or are willing to hide information from us, that there is, an additional sort of watchman watching the other watchman. And this might, bring us to a next point of conversation, the idea of all these bureaucratic rules. Are they stifling creativity and innovation? Has ethics gone too far in some ways? And I think that's a very interesting conversation to be had, because there are two ways of basically influencing ethics. The one is compliance, and the other one is this values-based ethic that we are trying to push into organizations. So I think the answer is that ethics is very important because it protects individuals from those bad actors or from scenarios where they might be exploited by others. And I guess if you can't trust the auditors and accountants, who can you trust? And I think that this is a lesson for us, for independent financial advisors, because if one of our members gives us all a bad name, there goes our business. Our business is built on trust. It is built on the idea that we will provide a return on investment for our clients, and that we will not do so in an extremely naughty way. Although there are some clients who may try to manipulate an IFA, not all people that we deal with have a good moral compass, Georgina. So we also have to, as IFAs, be careful and be resilient to kind of look out for these things. Because if you asked most investors, what do you want from an IFA, they would argue and say return on investment. So whether it's ethical or unethical, we don't really care. But a great example is that where it bit someone in the butt badly was the Vatican bank was caught out a few years ago for investing quite a large amount of money into these visa transactions. And they found out that these visa transactions were primarily for online pornography. And this got back to the Vatican in a very, very bad scandal, as if the organization could not, could afford another one. So the point is, is your investments aligned with the values that your customers hold or that you hold? And do you have a value system to protect you from the naughty investor or the naughty client, that might want to push your ethics in the wrong way? We often say in behavioral science that most people, you get your bad apples and you get your good apples. The unbendables and people who are, quite nasty in terms of their ethical compass. But these are very small numbers of people. The rest of us, the majority of us, are decent but somewhat dubious. We might actually be pulled in either direction, depending on the utility for us. So if an IFA does not have a moral compass, does not put down a value system and say, well, look, this is how I want to invest responsibly, then the chances are that we might actually, without our even knowing it consciously, be caught up in being manipulated either by the organization selling products or by the clients that might want a bit of a return on investment without the ethics being involved. So I think there's a great responsibility on us, in professions especially, to ensure that we act with integrity, or eventually our business will collapse. I want people to remember this. The client that we work with gives us our license to operate. It's like dancing with the dance partner. You don't have a business if you don't have a customer or an investor or someone that uses your product or service. Something that, for example, many institutions in South Africa have found out firsthand. So you need to ensure that that relationship is kept strong, that there's trust in that relationship over time, and that you are able to sort of foresee any ethical dilemmas or challenges that may arise in the future and mitigate them effectively.
Paul, you touched on something there which I think it feels quite close to my heart. And that's about ethics driving compliance. And I'm sure most of the viewers here can resonate with this, when I think that the pile of compliance that you had to do 5 years ago was something like this, and now it's something like this. And there's a perception that a lot of that is ethics driven. And then there's the other side, which I think is even more crucial, is that we get so tied up in red tape that we stifle creativity, we stifle innovation, and we get so caught up in ethics that we become defensive in the way that we actually carry out our business. And if you think about some of the great creators of past, which, you know, would they actually be employed today? I think it was C.S. Lewis, you know, Winston Churchill, John Steinbeck, all of whom had their own problems, their own issues, their own stories written about them. But out of them, we got some great either leadership or creativity that came from their work. Would we, I mean, you think of actors like Oliver Reed, there's no way anyone would employ him now. You know, are we missing out on some true genius because we're so scared of what people will think of us? And I think in fact, I was listening to a podcast with Stephen Fry, who said the very best screenwriters now aren't being employed because they're bipolar, or they're drunks, or they're, you know, they may have a history which is perhaps unpalatable to some viewers. Now, so we're left with, and I know someone is unhappy that I've called Djokovic boring, but essentially that's what we're left with. And I'm sorry about that, but it's how I feel. We're left with kind of like middle of the road boring, as opposed to creative genius. What do you think about that?
Ethics, let me answer it succinctly. I think ethics should never be boring or should stifle creativity in any way. And I think there's a misconception that ethics is about compliance, or that ethics is a law, right? And I think what we've noticed with organizations is that they often will pander to the social environment, right? This is often referred to in ethics as the common good approach. The idea that you have to consider your society, that you have to consider what they think as important. But they didn't read that far. Many organizations didn't read all the way down when it came to the common good approach, because there are weaknesses to the common good approach. For example, your society might be wrong. And if your society is wrong and you pander to them, you'll be caught out eventually. I mean, a great example of this is, let's talk about some of the positive deviants that we've seen in the past. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. These were individuals that by no means did stuff that was legal, but they saw that their societies were wrong and were able to stand against those societies. Unfortunately, organizations as of late, and this is a deep worry of mine and many other ethicists, is this idea of cancel culture, the idea that we're afraid to do the right thing because it might be unpopular, when in fact doing the right thing should be the right thing to do, even if it is unpopular with large groups of people. Now, there are two perspectives to ethics, two extreme perspectives, Georgina, that I want individuals to understand. And I'm not going to get academic. I'm just going to explain it very, very quickly. But there are two, imagine a line. And on this line, on the one end, you have what is called ethical relativism. And on the other end, you have what is called ethical or moral universalism. Now, relativism is what we often portray when we disagree with someone on an ethical basis, but we don't really feel comfortable to call them out on those ethics because it might be a tradition or an ethnic tradition that this group has. So we say, okay, your ethics is different from mine. I don't agree with your ethics, but I'm not going to debate you on your ethics, each to their own. Okay, and this is great in the sense that it does not cause any conflict. It actually reduces conflict in societies, especially with ethics differences or ethical differences that we may have. And by the way, those ethical differences are really small in comparison to what we all agree on in terms of ethics. But they are bones of contention. Now, the problem with relativism is that there is no moral development. I can never debate with someone about why they are wrong and come to some middle ground or conclusion that solves both of our ills or both of our problems, because we don't engage in that conversation when we are relativist. But it's nice in the sense that we avoid conflict. The opposite is also true, which we call moral or ethical universalism. This is where an individual, a group, or an institution, or even a culture forces its ethical perspective onto another. In other words, it's almost the opposite of relativism, right? It's where I'm saying to you, Georgina, I don't like your thinking around ethics, and you should think the way that I think. And this is almost a tyrannical way of bringing people in line with your ethics. And some organizations have started to do that. They've taken an ideology and have decided to force that ideology onto their own employees, but also onto those in society. And this is really not a great way of developing ethics or actually having good ethical conversations and coming to great ethical solutions. Because what you actually need is something in the middle where you're able to see the ethical differences, but you're able to converse about them. We refer to this in ethics as dialoguing. Dialoguing is when I have a conversation with someone else and I actually understand their point of view and I'm willing to compromise a little, and they are as well, to come to some solution regarding our differences. And this is where moral progress happens in societies, is when we dialogue. But if we stop dialoguing, and if you look at social media, for example, social media is the opposite of dialoguing. You are actually monologuing when you're on social media. You are talking about others to yourself. So you never really understand the perspective of the other. Or cancel culture, for example, another great example. We should cancel culture, Georgina, because it assumes a couple of things. Firstly, it assumes that no person can ever make a mistake. Secondly, if a person does make a mistake, they can never change. And thirdly, we can never really engage with perspectives that might not necessarily be aligned to our society and actually, develop our thinking further. So anything that shuts down conversation is extremely negative from an ethical perspective. So I think that, the question is, are organizations too ethical? I don't think that is the right way of asking it. I think we should rather ask, are organizations dealing with ethics correctly? Are they either too extreme on the universal sort of end, or are they, too extreme on the relativist end, where they don't say anything and kind of say, okay, well, I'll do business with the Saudi government and I'll do business in England, even though these two, countries have very different human rights records, and we'll see what the customers say. So I think that there is a balance that needs to be achieved, that we can't be on either end of the spectrum. We actually need to start opening conversations with our stakeholders, and we need to solve these problems. Otherwise, we are tyrants. And I think that organizations are learning very quickly that if they are ideologically tyrannical, it's biting them financially. It's also, they are losing a lot of their customers as a result of this. So I think the answer is very much, can we listen? Can we dialogue? Can we come to great conclusions, and also consider that our society is not always correct about ethics? I just want to leave with say one last thing on this, Georgina, but there was a great general in the US, in Canada, and his name escapes me now, but he spoke about military ethics, and he said, would I prefer as a soldier to have a soldier next to me that is a great soldier, right, that really does their job effectively when I'm in a trench and I'm fighting the enemy? But I know that he, for example, is a bit heavy on the bottle, after hours, and also, maybe beats his wife over the weekend. Or would I prefer a substandard soldier next to me who is moral in his private life? Now, I can't really answer that question, although all I can say is that if I'm at risk, I'll probably choose the soldier, right? And I think this is a great point, because ethics is not about ideologically right or wrong. This is where people make the greatest mistake regarding ethics. People often say, I'm either pro-life, let's say, or pro-choice on the abortion debate, when in fact you've already made a mistake there. If you are a true ethicist or you understand ethics, you would never ask a question like that. Instead, the question would be, under which conditions, under what context would you be pro-life or pro-choice? And this, I think, is where we have to start looking beyond the rules. We have to look beyond these ideological perspectives and actually start to understand one another. The only way I can understand your mind, Georgina, is when you speak to me. And you can hide things from me. I don't know what's going on in your head. There's actually a philosophical concept called the fear of the other, because we don't really know what's going on in someone else's head. And if we shut down communication with one another, we'll never know. And that fear will grow. And that is what we're seeing in our society at the moment.
Yeah, it really does feel like 20 years ago, the pendulum was here, and now it's swung all the way over here. And I think some people will feel that there is a silent majority who is ignored. They don't necessarily want the place where they buy their coffee to be meddling in politics or telling them how to behave towards abortion. And you think about certain companies who perhaps have really done damage to themselves in this area. And I think what people really get upset about is the inconsistencies. They say something in public, but actually do something quite different somewhere else. And you can think of, Netflix got into terrible trouble recently when it decided it didn't want to do any filming in the up and coming filming area of Georgia because of various abortion laws that were coming into place there. Yet they were still quite happy to deal with and to go and film in China, where there's very controversial human rights positions being held there. So it's that inconsistencies that I think people really feel very strongly about. And trying to get that right, and as you quite rightly say, where's the balance? Where are we on that continuum? And then you end up with a keyboard warrior behind the keyboard, actually making people scared about making a decision, doing something different, actually putting their neck on the line. J.K. Rowling has been, completely hauled over the coals by actors that she made famous as well. So it feels rather unfair sometimes to actually stick your neck out and actually hold a view. And you can actually signaling. And you can actually stem this back as well into things like surgery, into the doctor's area. You think about a patient coming in and you're worried about legalities and am I going to, if I do something, I may well be taken to court. And there's all sorts of ways in which you defend that, and you just provide defensive medical care, as opposed to really challenging the boundaries and actually trying new and different things because you may not have the support of the organizations that govern you. It's that kind of creativity that I think many people are worried about stifling because of the ethics fear that sits around cancel culture, it sits around virtue signaling, it sits around all of these different things. And for a lot of people, they think that pendulum has swung too far.
Yeah, and it's going to swing, Georgina. I think this is what ethics is. It ebbs and flows. You can take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. We've seen, for example, if you look historically, after the fall of the Roman Empire, for example, there was a period called the Dark Ages because we don't know much about them. But what we do know is that people murdered one another tremendously during that time. It was a very harsh environment to live in. So we can regress ethically as well. And we've seen that happen to certain countries. But I think the key message that you said, and this is so important, it's one of the reasons why at the Ethics Institute, we don't call ourselves the Ethical Institute. Because if you virtue signal, what you're doing is you're actually telling people, listen, I am telling you what is right and wrong, and I'm willing to punish those that do not follow my value system. But the problem is that when you do that, you make a target out of yourself. So if you make a mistake, people are going to call you out on your virtue signaling. So, it's not a great idea for an organization to advertise that they are the most ethical company. It's not a great idea for an organization to virtue signal without considering the realities of what is going on out there, because they will be caught out eventually, especially if they virtue signal without it being backed up by real, authentic values, within the organization. So we have to be careful of saying that we are the most ethical, or, and as I said earlier, of ideologically forcing our ethics onto others. If you imagine having a friend that's a bit preachy, and they tell you constantly, oh, you shouldn't do this, and why are you eating meat? It's unethical, etc. Of course, you're going to look for any opportunity to find that where they are a hypocrite, right? Are you wearing leather shoes, but you're not eating meat, right? So I think it's important that if you do stand on a pedestal and force your ideology onto others, that you do not, that often that ideology can come back to bite you. And so we have to see, I think organizations and individuals have to learn that we are human. We make mistakes. The question, of course, is that if we make those mistakes, are we able to admit that we've made them and then fix them? That is what people are really interested in. But if you virtue signal, you're kind of sealing your own doom, so to speak, because people will find things that aren't aligned with that. So it comes back to that tyrannical ethics, the idea of forcing my ideology onto others, which is a very negative thing that's happened, very recently, with large organizations now realizing that they have the power to change the narrative in society, that they can, for example, Twitter, which is the public discourse area, that what Elon Musk would call, the public soapbox, so to speak, where we discuss things. If you start to censor, for example, what people are saying on Twitter based on your own ideological views, you will be called out on it. It's only a matter of time. So I think organizations have to burn their fingers, Georgina, before they realize this is not a great idea.
Well, I tell you who did get burnt horribly was Gillette. You know, they spent years telling all the men out there that it was the best a man could get, lots of chiseled chins and beautiful stubble or clean shaven. And then they decided that actually masculinity wasn't a great idea after the Me Too campaign, and that they told men to be less masculine. And I believe they dropped from about 7th in the home and personal care rankings right to the bottom. You know, consumers don't like being told how to behave by the place where they buy their razor. So there's lots of examples, I think, where people have got their fingers burnt rather publicly as well. I'm just scanning through the questions, Paul. Some great questions, great interactions, guys. Thank you so much for interacting in the way you do. There's quite a few in there about the ethics of a country. How you know, if you're a South African company and you're doing everything you can to be as ethical as you possibly can in the private sector, how do the ethics of a country such as South Africa, which is on the brink of being grey listed, how does that affect the ethics of the entire ecosystem?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. The answer is not going to be as upbeat as I think people would like to have, but there's a great article that was written by Ashkenazi, Windsor, and Trevino. They are 3 researchers that look closely at ethics, particularly in societies, and Trevino is probably the foremost expert on ethical leadership. But they use this analogy. They talk about what they call apples, barrels, and warehouses. The warehouse is the country or the larger socioeconomic environment in which you are operating. Now, the barrels are the organizations or institutions that basically are warehoused, you know, in this warehouse, and then the apples are the individuals that obviously are stored within each of these barrels. It's a great analogy because it works quite well. So, let's start on the other end first. So, for example, one bad apple, especially if they're in a position of leadership, could spoil a barrel, could spoil an entire organization. But also, bad apples tend to stick out when they enter into a good barrel. You can see who's the bad apple. They might feel uncomfortable. And so an ethical culture also acts as an immune system on the individual level. But organizations and their ethics are very much influenced by the warehouse that they are stored in. That is the larger socioeconomic and political environment in which you are operating. And organizations fool themselves if they think that they could enter into, let's say, a country that doesn't have a very good ethics record or is suffering from major corruption and so on, that they will not be tempted or pushed into scenarios where they might themselves engage in those behaviors. Sometimes it is so prevalent. I mean, up to the 1990s, if you were a French or German company and you operated in Africa or in South America, you were given, bribery was tax deductible. They called these facilitation payments. So you could actually list to the government how much money you spent in that country to bribe officials in order to get business going. Now, this has happened for many years, and it's actually damaged the environment in these countries massively because it's now kind of expected that you should pay a bribe, right? But the problem is that, you know, we might see bribes as an irritation. But if you look at South Africa, I mean, recently I read an article about pit toilets in the Eastern Cape. And they tended to build actual flush toilets there. There's actually a young girl that fell into one of these pit toilets and died. I mean, it's a horrific story. And so the government decided to upgrade these pit toilets. But if you look at all the corruption that happened, from the tendering, the middlemen, the parasites, the leaky, let's say, hosepipe, right, through which the money is flowing, it ended up that they estimated that a single toilet cost over 70,000 Rand. To purchase, not even install, just the toilet. That is how expensive it became after everyone greased a palm. So the point is that the countries in which you operate have an influence on the organizations that operate there. And unfortunately, South Africa has learned this very quickly. Great examples are MTN, who burnt their fingers horribly by entering into countries that did not have the greatest record in terms of ethics or corruption. They went in there despite the risks, not asking the question of, should we enter here? Could this be problematic? But just went in and fell victim in almost every case to them. I mean, I think there was an incident with MTN in Afghanistan where they actually were held ransom by the Taliban at some point to switch off cell towers at a certain time, which got them red listed in the US. So the point that I'm trying to make is South Africa at the moment is coming out of state capture. We're realizing that almost all of the major institutions were in some way involved. They are now looking at banks and how banks facilitated some of these entities that engaged in state capture. So the answer is actually a little bit of a cynical one, and that is that the organization is often more affected by the social political environment in which it operates than vice versa. That being said, let me give you a little bit of hope here. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a survey that looks very widely at the trust that people have all over the world in their institutions and whether they view them as competent, are they actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, and whether they are ethical, right? Whether they can be trusted, has come up with the following results. Firstly, almost no one in the world trusts their government and also feel that their governments are incompetent. So they're both incompetent and cannot be trusted. Most individuals also said that the media are incompetent and cannot be trusted. They do trust non-profit organizations, but they also feel non-profits have not a lot of power or influence. So they are considered to be trustworthy, but not that competent. The only institution in the world that the Edelman Trust Barometer indicated is both trusted and competent is private business. So this puts a hell of a lot of expectation on private organizations, where people have also indicated in a multitude of surveys across the world, they want their organizations to be more socially involved. They want them to put pressure on the governments in which they operate to operate ethically. They want them, especially the CEO, to take up these social and ethical issues, because we can't trust our government or the media to do it. But this has, of course, Georgina, put a hell of a lot of pressure on CEOs. In the last 3 years or so, CEO burnout rates have been at all-time highs. So we also have to balance that relationship. But I think our view at the Ethics Institute is that we can build an ethical society, one ethical organization at a time. Organizations have immense power. They can train people on right and wrong. They can impart an ethical perspective on their members, and especially those that are not necessarily skilled or have a schooling background. They pay taxes. They produce a service in the economy. So organizations have a lot of power to change the narrative. And a great example of this is the Coalition of Integrity or Organizational Integrity in Mozambique, which is a number of organizations there that have come together and said, we want joint power to start forcing the government to make more ethical decisions and refuse to do business with the government if the government does not make certain promises in terms of ethics. And again, one last thing, if you have to poll any organization in South Africa and ask them, what is your greatest risk? Most private organizations would say undoubtedly doing business with government. So I think that there is a power there that we have as organizations to actually change the narrative. But I think, being a bit more cynical, it often is the other way around. But organizations have to be more aware of this.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. That example of Mozambique is fascinating. Perhaps there's a feeling here, almost a feeling of despair sometimes I feel in South Africa, that we are not at the place where perhaps we're collaborating together to form these councils, if you like, to challenge government altogether. However, I know you're much closer to the coalface. You deal with a lot of, and you talk to a lot of organizations, both state-owned and privately owned. Have you seen, since state capture, have you seen some real movement towards ethical behavior, ethical initiatives? And are you broadly optimistic for the future of South Africa?
I am. I don't think I would be in this in my profession if I was not. There are a number of government which the bad news always makes headlines. The good news, in terms of ethics, is always seen as, oh, but that's how we should behave, right? So we don't really recognize for that. But for example, there are a number of local government initiatives. Legally is one of them. where the local government, together with the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, have started working to bring ethics back to municipalities. They are working on training their people, on making them understand that they are rendering a service to their society. Of course, Georgina, this is not going to take a month to do. It's going to take years to get this right. We've had years of state capture. We've had years of mismanagement and graft. And it's not going to turn around in a day. It's going to take time. But slowly but surely, these groups are starting to speak the right language. They're starting to understand their mandate. I mean, there was a great article written in the US a while ago by, I think it was Latani and Weinstein. They are actually biologists. And they looked at organizations from a biological lens. And they estimated that in the US, about 20% of organizations operating in the US are what they call parasitic. In other words, they don't add anything to the economy. They simply scoop from it, right? A great example is a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme or corruption. Any of these things are considered to be parasitic. So the question is now, can we raise the knowledge of people in our government to know that the purpose, their service orientation, their mandate is to look after the public. And so there are many of these initiatives, like Legally, many others. There's a new initiative now in the state-owned enterprise sector in South Africa that is trying its best to kind of look more closely at building ethical cultures, not just managing ethics, because a lot of companies just say, oh, we manage it. And then they report on it, and then they get 5 out of 5 stars. But they have no way of proving that they've actually improved the culture, that they're actually now building a mutually beneficial relationship with their stakeholders. And this is now what the drive is in the South African economy. But like all hornets' nests, it might get a lot worse before it gets better. The only thing is we need to stay the course. Things are rectifying, but it takes decades to rectify things like this.
And when you say it's likely to be a little bumpy along the way, is that as more things come to light, as more bribery, corruption, et cetera, starts to come to light, and perhaps there's more narrative around, point of no return?
Yes, I think you must remember that an organization is a weird place in the sense that it has its own culture. And its leadership select individuals into it, right? That to share the values of that group. That is usually the number one way of selecting someone. It's not really based on their competence or other elements. It's got a lot more to do with values, whether they share the values of, let's say, the leadership group or the interviewers or whomever. So that values alignment is so important. But as good people with good values could align to a good organization, so too people that have dubious values would be attracted to organizations that have dubious values. So it's not just getting rid of the leaders, it's also now getting rid of the colluders. And those colluders have been put into those positions for many, many years. So you get rid of the head of the snake, but there's about 20 other youngling snakes waiting to take that position now. You have to root that out as well. I mean, a great example is if you read publicly about Eskom, they fired a number of people that they thought were involved in these corrupt activities, such as damaging certain power stations, just to get contracts, right? Now they've removed those people only for those individuals that benefited from that person being in charge, the loyalty that is shown to that individual that got them a bit of business. For those groups of people to now sabotage and engage in acts of sabotage at Eskom and at their facilities. So the point is that it's not just the toxic or destructive leader that needs to be removed. After they're gone, the colluders need to be removed. And then, of course, you also get the willing followers, those that are loyal to the leader because they've benefited in some way from that leader. And in South Africa, we have a particular problem separating the virtue of loyalty with ethics. Sometimes we prioritize loyalty beyond ethics. And this is a huge problem, which is why we don't have a lot of whistleblowers. It's very seldom that a whistleblower actually comes forward. And also that people feel, oh, I'm betraying this person that has helped me, gain this income or gain this job. They are unethical, but they're looking after me, right? There's honor amongst thieves. So I think that is a big problem, and we have to in South Africa and in Africa more broadly and the world understand that virtues aren't always virtues. We have to understand the limits of a virtue, of, for example, loyalty. That it is important for us to look at the bigger picture. It's not just about my benefit or their benefit. It's about our country and its people. It's about the most vulnerable in our communities. We have to consider the needs of others beyond our own little spheres of influence. And if we can start thinking that way, perhaps there is hope, for South Africa going forward.
Paul, I've so enjoyed our conversation. It has been so much more than I think a lot of our viewers were expecting today, certainly than what I was expecting to, as I alluded to at the top of the show today. Thank you so much. I don't think this is the end. I think we've got far more conversations, particularly, we didn't even get onto sport, rugby, the weekend before. We didn't even get there. So don't worry, we'll come back and we'll talk about other areas of ethics, because I think it pervades through so many areas of society. It just leaves me to say thank you very much. Please do tune in on the 27th to Steve Backhouse, who's got an In the Room with Old Mutual. Interestingly enough and relevantly enough, they're talking about ESG and the changes in ESG in the last 12 months particularly. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much for joining me today.
INN8 is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorised financial services provider.